There was already an understanding for a place art holds that the natural sciences can't cover. As artists or designers, we are allowed to broaden the scope.
Art-Sci Currents is built on the idea that art and science are better together. But what does that actually look like in practice, not as a philosophy, but as a lived, working method? Rasa Weber is a designer, researcher, and diver whose work sits at the intersection of critical ecology and design. A significant part of her research happens underwater, and she dives into marine ecosystems not to admire them, but to notice them, to stay with them, to let what she finds there fundamentally change how she designs. This conversation is a tangible example of art science in action. It's about what happens when you stop trying to solve nature and start learning to work with it instead. I'm your host, Nistia John, and let's dive in. Thank you so much, Rasa, for joining on this call. It's really exciting to have you share more about your experience in design and art and creativity and in your research. And I feel like you have such an interesting point of view on how you intersect worlds. Can you just tell us a little bit about your research and where you are right now in ecology and design?
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation. I'm Rasa Weber. I'm a designer, researcher, and diver. And I work on the intersection of design and critical ecologies with a special focus on marine environments. So currently, I'm mostly underwater, in the water, around the water, working with the sea. I have some specific interest in reef ecology, the question of how to build habitats that bridges to very different environments. But generally, my whole work revolves around the question of how we can move from an industrial to a post-industrial or non-industrial or less industrial framework. And that's kind of a challenge that a lot of people are working on right now. Some of them call it modern human design or multi-species design. I kind of feel at home in different worlds. Like I've been educated classically as a product and industrial designer, and I moved into materials research, and then from there came into this subject of ecology and modern human worlds.
In our first discussion, we talked about your relationship to diving and how you got into that after your research. But I'd love to know why you're so fascinated by this underwater world after having this background in design and industrial product design. What drew you to the world of water?
I came to diving some like 4 or 5 years ago, and I started to research a marine environment without any professional training in diving, no real idea about marine ecology. So I'm really kind of a newcomer to this field. But what drew me to it is, for me, the ocean gives me an opportunity to unlearn many aspects of design because it's such a challenging environment. You're relying on so many mediated technologies that keep you alive down there. So it's kind of a thrill, and it's also kind of an excitement to go diving. And I'm interested in the diving practice that brings us closer to ecosystems as they are. And what I mean by that is not so much seeking for the most exotic environment and the remote and untouched places, but noticing that most of the marine ecosystem that we are confronted with right now is one that is deeply entangled with human interventions. One of my earliest dive experiences I ever had in 2022, I went to Curacao, which is an island off the coast of Venezuela. And it's so interesting because, on the one hand, it's one of the top places for marine ecology and coral reef research. So a lot of people that do marine research would go to Curacao for its pristineness and untouchedness. I was interested in restoration procedures, but I came to know a reef ecology that was deeply disrupted, or you could also say a blasted seascapes. So this blasted seascape in Curacao came to me as a surprise. I was there with a dive instructor, and I asked him, well, we've been around this beautiful coral reef all the time. Do you have any other place you would recommend going? Maybe one that is not so beautiful. And he was like, why would you go there? That's just terrifying. I was like, yeah, basically that's what I'm after. Like there's a lot of things that you could learn from these ecosystems that are not so beautiful. And he pointed me to a recent construction site of a cruise ship here. And this place is basically a desert, but you see a lot of the broken off coral branches. And when diving there, it really struck me how this marine ecology is so much more representative of what we are confronted with right now than any beautiful coral reef that you could visit as a tourist. We try to master these places, design them, change them due to our own needs. Anything that goes into the water will affect very remote areas because you're kind of like you're swimming in a solution. And this really sharpened my lens on what I'm interested in to research on. And that's really these places that are, you could say, post-industrial in a way that they've been deeply disrupted by humans, but still kind of shows some aspect of life. I mean, they're not dead in a way that there's nothing there anymore. It's just not what we expect life to look like. And it's just not what we expect a beautiful coral reef to look like.
There's so much in there that I'd like to pull on. I love that you mentioned swimming with the solution because there's such a hard contrast between swimming with the solution versus swimming with the lack of beauty or the problem itself. But I'd love to go back to the idea of design. You talked a lot about the way that design often focuses on solving a problem. Do you feel like the world of design can adapt in this way to meet these kinds of changes in environments?
Yeah, it's a struggling question and a great one. And it's also something that I'm keep discussing and debating with my design students. I mean, design itself is often perceived as a world steering discipline that is kind of top down in the way that it goes into the world seeking for solutions, tackling problems, finding fast answers, and questioning this role of design as a steward of the world and trying to rephrase the role of the designer is challenging, especially because design itself is born out of an industrial framework. Design and the industry are so deeply entangled that any attempt to step out of this relationship and make design more humble, slower, stubborn, less solution oriented would always question the role of the designer as such. I do believe that there is new places for designers to discover, such as policy making and conservation ecology and so on. These are all fields that we should try to go into as designers. But it's not an easy task. And for me, I really draw on as many designers do nowadays, draw on the theory of Donna Haraway, her take on sympoiesis as a strategy for design. Donna Haraway says something humorous like, sympoiesis is a simple word. It means making with. And I do believe that sympoiesis is a simple word, but it's definitely not a simple practice because making with entails not moving away from technology as such, not moving away from the world that we inhabit right now, but trying to acknowledge that the human and the modern human, the technological, the cultural world are deeply intertwined. And this relational perspective on design, seeing design as complicit, but also seeing design as part of a new relationship building practice is something that I'm really after. I call it Sympoietic Design. So the idea is really that making with could be a form of an art. And when we talk about modern humans, that gets really tricky because you kind of go into a territory where you assume that you know what fish think, what fish like, but you actually don't. I mean, how would you know that? You assume that you know what corals need, but you actually don't. So a lot of the questions of how modern human design would take shape are not easy to answer, and they need noticing, not making in many cases. So when I say I'm returning to ecosystems again and again and again, I do that for a good reason, not just because I enjoy the dive. Yes, I do. But also because I believe that staying with an ecosystem and noticing it over time, over seasonal change, would change my practices as a designer and would affect the choices that I make as a designer. Like my first prototype that I ever built underwater was enormous. It was a 2.5 diameter sphere made from metal. And I was drawing on an experimental practice that I happened to come across in papers called the Biorock principle. That was developed by an architect. So Wolf Hilbert started to experiment on this in the 1970s. I was totally fascinated to find that an architect was bold enough to go diving and then develop this technology. When I started working with it, I also explored its limitations and problems because trying to solve technology by technology and by technology. And you're kind of getting into this techno fix mindset that keeps you busy and it produces very impressive works. And funny enough, my first experiment I ever did is structure that I talk about right now. I called it Kiki. And Kiki is kind of very present in media representations of my work. Humans love it. Kiki is kind of like the image of what we want to see underwater, apparently. However, the fish were really uninterested in Kiki. So Kiki kind of lacked any small holes and cavities, like spots to hide. So the scale is super attractive for the human eye, but it was really not relevant for the fish to inhabit. And that was kind of a big learning curve for me that this big statement was not what was needed. After the first experiment, I started to move away from the technology and also from the size and dimensions of this prototype and decisively scaled down and also changed material. I looked and I was very fascinated by fish traps and traditional artisanal practices around marine ecosystems and fishing practices. But my idea was kind of to build on that knowledge and systems and just leave the door open and allow fish to pass freely through these architectures, but drawing on their techniques. So I came to research a lot of traditional materials that were used around the Mediterranean ecosystem that I was working with, specifically Corsican region. And for example, willow is a material that was often used for fish trap architectures. And I searched for artisans who knew how to work with this material. So when I say I deeply transformed my practice, it also means I stepped back in many ways in mastering my design process. I started to integrate a lot of different knowledge cultures, started to get in contact with people that knew so much more than I did about these technologies and try to find out how they perceive it.
Interdisciplinary ideas are exciting to imagine, but surprisingly hard to build. Not because the idea isn't good, but because without a clear structure, even the most compelling concepts can delay. The Art Science in Motion framework is a digital workbook with that structure. 5 guided modules will take you from a scattered idea to a defined, testable proof of concept. Our easy-to-follow worksheets will help you name what you're doing, understand why it matters, and give you a roadmap for all that comes next. Download your copy at creart.ca/store.
The team at Staresso, the research station that I'm working with, is so interesting because they are super young and dynamic, but they've been present at this research site since the 70s as an institution. So I was in conversation with the scientists, I was in conversation with weavers. A lot of my work revolves around creating these contact zones between scientists, artisans, fish, try to see where this comes together or how this comes together, or maybe even seeing that it doesn't work. For me, design as a relational practice, as a practice of making with Sympoiesis is really what I'm after. And that means radically open up my ideas about what I want to do and integrate the views of others.
Talked about the beginning of how your design experience, your design journey brought you to this point where you're like, I have to present something that's stunning and this is the final product. Then you transition into this noticing moment where the big idea didn't really serve the environment. And so it opened up your process to working with so many different people. And I think so many people call themselves designers, like they're fashion designers, they're graphic designers, or so many different ways of entering that world of design. Can you just expand a little bit on who is a designer? Is there something common between all of these fields that you think categorizes someone as a designer?
Haha, that's a trick question. There's like two ways that I could answer this. And one is I do feel the need to kind of speak for my practice as a discipline that is trained and that has a certain skill set. And I do believe that there is something like a designer and that is like a practice that we can learn or train. However, of course, it's a practice that is porous and transferable. And the question is maybe not so much what is the designer, but what is the role of the designer in systems that I'm describing. Because what is interesting about it, if we think about the concept of a designer, when we think about Bauhaus times or like the 1950s and the great ideas of what is a good design, gute Form, gute Gestaltung, then we are kind of faced with this very normative and ultimate ideas of design as styling and shape making. Perhaps design as material shaping. That was kind of what the Bauhaus brought in, right? So working through the understanding of craft and of shaping different materials and working with the materials affordances is something that the Bauhaus really brought forward. And maybe it's not so much different, it's just tweaking it a notch further and saying if design is not only about this enclosed ecosystem or environment of the industrial institutions, and if it's not only about the workshop environments and mastering materials, but it's also about ecologies and environments and the collaboration with living entities, then what design needs is really the skill set to work with the living. And working with the living is just much more complicated than mastering the living. Traditionally, as a designer, you learn how to shape wood, how to shape metal, how to shape stone, how to shape ceramics. But we tend to forget that all these materials derive from living ecosystems. They're not just there as that matter to be manipulated, they come from relationships. And moving into this idea of design, drawing on these relationships and engaging means that design is really much more mediating, facilitating, cultivating than just extracting, taking, mastering. If you understand this as design, then I would be okay with saying this is something that anyone could learn and should learn because it's kind of one of the basic skills of our human condition. I love to think about Lynn Margulis, the biologist and evolutionary theorist, who used to always call into remembrance that survival is not so much about survival of the fittest, but survival of the most collaborative. And she was also one of the persons who kept reminding everyone on the fact that saving life on this planet is really not what is needed. What we need to save is our human existence on this planet. And the best way to do that is by being less intrusive and more humble, trying to step a bit back and noticing what is possible and what is maybe not possible for us as humans, seeing our limitations, perceiving where things are getting out of hand. So a lot of the research that I did was not only in building structures, building interfaces or making offers to species, but also to try to develop a catalog of methods. And this is also understood as an open field catalog. So I do this in conversation or as an invitation to other researchers because I believe that there's many more methods to explore. But one of the most obvious ones is, of course, sketching and note-taking on the water. That actually draws on a whole history of painting on the water that I wasn't aware of before, that reaches back to the 19th century. So the earliest dive bells were constructed like these huge spheres where people could sit in, and there were already a few artists that would try to sketch and paint underwater. One of the ones that I think is worth noting is Else Bostelmann. She's a German artist, and she was invited to accompany research trips of a biologist called William Bibé. He did explorations of marine ecologies and coral reefs around the world, and she would accompany him on the ship. And she was kind of hired as an artist to draw the experiences that he made. But the idea was, since she was a woman, that she shouldn't go diving, but he would go diving with a phone connection. Like he had his pipe or this tube on the surface, and he would describe what he sees. But that was kind of frustrating for her because she could only imagine what she should draw, and then she could draw the things that were trawled to the surface. So they would bring fish up, but a lot of the fish and species were deformed when brought up to the surface, of course, because they're made for other conditions. So her sketches ended up not being accurate or being quite imaginative, even though they are beautiful. And at some point, she was just fed up with the situation and wanted to dive herself. So there's this story that she, at some point, decided that she wanted to go into the dive bell, and she just did that and took her painting equipment with her and just sat in this dive bell on the sea floor and started to sketch the water from within or the seascape from within. And for me, that was super interesting to see that there's this whole narrative of encountering the sea by being in the sea, which is fundamentally different than doing it from the surface. I think it's really an important epistemological shift to be in something and experience it by being within.
Imagine that it's possible to sit on the ocean floor and just observe and draw. And it's such a serenity that I'm imagining by sitting there and just being with nature. And in contrast to approaching it as this is something we need to fix or understand or solve. I'd like to know what your approach to creativity is in your own practice because you are creative in so many ways. How do you touch on creativity in what you do either in the lab or outside of the lab?
Creativity for me is more a matter of combining things that haven't been brought together. A lot of the really innovative ideas that humans bring into this world are not so much based on totally new ideas, but are often based on the fact of bringing things together that haven't been brought in touch. A lot of the ideas that I'm drawing on are really out of the knowledge of others that have already worked on a subject and just bringing people, species, materials together that haven't been combined. Change simple gestures in the design. For example, fish traps that are made for extinguishing life could be turned into fish architectures that invite life. And the only difference is that you leave the door open or you close the door. And just these small twists in the idea could bring forward a totally different approach to the world. For me, creativity really means trying to shift perspective a little bit. And for shifting perspective, what you need is a different mode of perception, like being very open and then being able to learn from circumstances, trying to understand. And also just the aspect of making and failing is quite important in that. So the like holding the tension of not knowing where this would lead you, staying with the trouble.
Can we go deeper into that idea of staying with the trouble? Because you talked about it so beautifully when we first discussed this and origins of the word trouble. I'd love to hear just even more about that feeling of wrestling with something that might not be working or something that's challenging.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, and that's not me, but Donna Haraway who says it, that staying with the trouble is something that's quite essential for us right now in the circumstances that we are in. Or we could also say we don't have any other choice at the moment than staying with the trouble because our times are troubling in many different ways. What she drew my attention to is this beautiful translation of trouble coming from the French meaning of stirring up sand, making things cloudy. And I think that relates so well to diving because what you do in diving is using fins and stirring up sand, making things cloudy. So for me, diving is kind of a great practice of staying with the trouble because it's in itself troubling and unsettling. Also for us as humans, just being on the water can be a very troubling experience. It's not just beautiful. Many people struggle to be underwater for a longer period of time and find it scary. Staying with the trouble is for me really a way of opening the possibility of noticing that things are not perfect and yet staying with that and yet kind of holding this tension. And I do believe that design as an industrial discipline is very poorly trained in this ability of staying with the trouble because we tend to go the shortcut to the beautiful narrative and to the great solution. And that's kind of satisfying. I mean, no doubt it's great to have the feeling of leading ourselves out of the trouble. But the realization is that, of course, design has also been complicit in producing trouble. I mean, the reality of diving or the reality of staying with troubled ecosystems is not one of mutual friendship and harmony, but it's tuning into dissonances and problems and tuning into the fact that species don't necessarily want to interact. So, holding the tension of not being welcome, of not making things better, are part of the story.
Mm-hmm. Quick question. Have you ever felt like the only person in the room who cares about the logic and the creativity, the experiment and the exhibition, the data set and the performance? Well, you're not alone, you just haven't found your people yet. The CREMAP Directory of Innovators and Art Scientists is the CREART Foundation's global directory of multidisciplinary minds, a searchable, growing community of practitioners who live exactly at that intersection. Create your free profile, get discovered, and find collaborators who actually speak your interdisciplinary language. To learn more, head to creart.ca/cremap, that's creart.ca/CREMAP, and join the network. You talked about humility a little bit earlier in that you have to pull yourself back from the situation and see the greater cause. And so I think design in relationship to the environments that you're working with, there is that tension between what can be done and what wants to be done and how things can be done. But I also think that there might be a different sense of trouble when you're working with another person because we talked about collaboration earlier and the value of listening in and allowing other people's knowledge set to inform how to approach a problem or approach trouble. What is that like in practice in terms of staying with the trouble, but with people?
Yeah, right now, a lot of research revolves around the question of how we can open up disciplines and which kind of transdisciplinary encounters are needed in response to ecological crisis, for example. And I do believe that there's a huge strength in trying to bridge disciplinary gaps and finding some form of a shared language. However, the objective of encounters between design, art, and biology, for example, is not necessarily one of mutual friendship and eternal harmony. I do think that tensions and discrepancies in collaboration can be quite productive. What I feel is often happening in the relationship between artistic practices and, for example, the natural sciences is kind of a problem of hierarchy and a lot of presumptions about what the role of the artist should be. And for that, I think looking back to my earlier example of Else Bostelmann and William Bebe is actually kind of a strikingly good one because it shows a lot of the discrepancies of the understanding of what art can do. And what William Bebe thought Else Bostelmann can do for him is sit on the surface and represent his scientific findings. So she would sketch what he would understand. And strangely enough, more than half a century later, this fantasy of what the role of art is still the same in many circles of the natural sciences. So they think that design makes things beautiful. And if you come into these interdisciplinary collaborations, I think this is kind of the essential stress test for the collaboration already in the beginning, the trying to understand if there's something like a shared research objective. And by a shared research objective, I don't mean can you provide a communication form or like make our findings beautiful for natural science communication? No, that's not what I mean. What I mean is, are there perhaps two different overlapping research questions that at some point intersect? It doesn't need to be the same research question, but I do believe that collaborating on shared projects needs to have some kind of tangential interest in trying to produce relevant knowledge for both fields. I still think there's a huge strength in making as a practice. And I was recently asked by my supervisor and colleague Karin Harasa, well, wouldn't it be easier to just stop making? Because we're speaking so much about these colonial legacies, about the problems that design also co produced. Why should we go on with this? Why shouldn't we just stop making altogether? However, I still feel that there's a power in trying to change things, and there's a hopeful gesture in trying to make and produce things. And the best argument for making for me is really the collaborative momentum. When I talk about bringing together artisans and scientists, of course, I could have talked about the problem of climate change in the ocean, but it would have remained extremely abstract. The moment that I brought in an object, like let's build a fish village, people were super engaged because they can understand and relate to it. They can craft and make it, and they can, yeah, they can participate. And that's something that is so evident that any child could join this process because weaving and going into the world by crafting it is a way that every human being is trying to relate to the world around it, right? So it's a joy and a pleasure of playing almost that you are able to manipulate things around you. And of course, any manipulation comes with intrusion. It comes with a risk of failure and making things wrong. But I'd rather risk to make things wrong than to not make any more.
I really understand that because I feel like you're also changing my entire perspective on how art and science can be integrated. Because for the foundation, you really are trying to see what is the intersection between art and science. Like, where Can people who actively pursue multiple different specialties, where can they find a place to allow these ideas to grow? In the way that you discuss design, it seems like this intellectual approach to how you can bring collaboration together between the arts and sciences is what can generate something else in between, or what can really create a shift. And because of a lot of our listeners are probably actively searching between this art space, the science space, and design space, I'd love to hear from you. What do you feel like is important for someone with this kind of mentality of making something at the intersection?
I practiced my art science muscle very early in my career. And I remember my first attempt to do so, which was during the development phase of a project that was called Alchemy, and it dealt with microalgae as a pigment for textile printing. And the way that I encountered this material was by trying to get into laboratories that work with algae by growing them in the lab. And what brought me to these places was my persistence. I really knocked on a few doors. At that time, I was much younger. I was not a name at all, and I still managed to get into Fraunhofer Institute, one of the big science institutions in Germany, to discuss about the ways that they research on living single cell beings. Something about that has not changed. The way that I try to build my projects is generally driven by curiosity and a lot of gut feeling, I must admit. But then it comes with persistence of trying to find people that I want to work with. And I'm stressing here trying to find people, not disciplines or renowned laboratories or so on, because in the end, it comes down to mutual understanding, and you will not be able to shape that from the best crafted research expose. You will not be able to shape that with the most elaborate idea, but you need to be generally open to encounter someone. And you will only do so by meeting people and trying to get to know their interests. For example, for the collaboration with Staresso and the Max Planck Institute, you wouldn't believe how many researchers I met before. I was really speed dating different institutions, and I had so many preconceived ideas of I need a coral scientist, I need this and that laboratory because they sound interesting and they're the most prestigious one in that field and so on. In the end, it comes down to human encounters and mutual interest. For Max Planck Institute, my chances were good because Max Planck had started to work with other artists in the past, and that was born out of the interest of the head of research there for artistic practices. So he had kind of a genuine interest. There was already kind of an understanding, or at least a gut feeling, for a place art holds that the natural sciences can't cover. As artists or designers, we are allowed to broaden the scope and translate these questions into actual interactions, into experiments, into artistic experiments. And I think that can be really powerful and also shifting a paradigm. My feeling right now is that we're finding ourselves in a backlash where these frameworks of open-ended research investigations between different disciplines are kind of pushed back, are not facilitated anymore. I do think that in institutions like our schools, educational frameworks, even for school children, there's still space for exploring these questions, because these questions will later influence the way that policy making is shaped, will influence the way that we as researchers, as scientists, as humans get access to resources, to funding, to new institutions. And that means for me bringing these questions of ecology, of transdisciplinarity to universities, also trying to confront much younger students with the questions of ecosystemic stewardship, of practices of care, of making, and opening up the possibilities of bringing these systems together. It really means trying to think out of the box of these classical, streamlined educational frameworks where you learn one thing or the other, where you have to decide for one subject or another. When I look back to my own education, I profited the most from these crossovers where you were able to explore different fields at the same time, where you were kind of invited to combine different subjects by your genuine interest and not by a curriculum. And I don't mean that as a hollowed out term as art science and then nobody knows what it means. It means really going into it with methodologies and trying to invite students to educate themselves in something like biology, to draw on this and become much more precise in how they want to integrate this into their own practice. And it often means that they have to learn a lot before they can craft with it, because we know that, I mean, something like growing mycelia in the lab or growing algae and so on, it's nothing that is easy, but it has to, it has to be trained to understand what you can do with it and understand the parameters. But you can train your art science muscle by doing it again and again.
Rasa's idea of staying with the treble is not a last resort, but a practice, a deliberate choice to hold the tension of not knowing, not fixing, and not rushing to the answer. And what she makes clear is that this applies just as much to collaboration as it does to ecosystems. The most generative encounters between disciplines, between people, between ways of knowing, they rarely start with harmony. They start with the willingness to remain in discomfort long enough for something new to emerge. The in-between space isn't a waiting room. It's where the actual work happens. A kind of humility, a kind of persistence is what art science actually looks like when it's lived. I'm Missia John, your host and founder, and this is Art-Sci Currents. Links to Rasa's work and research are in the show notes, and if you found this conversation as practical as I did, then share with someone you know. Thanks for joining us in this episode of Art-Sci Currents, where conversations between disciplines become new ways of thinking, creating, and connecting. We see art scientists as translators of complexity, innovators who bring artistry, research, and human understanding together. If you've ever felt pulled between disciplines, this space is for you, and I hope this conversation inspires you to see what's possible in your own journey. This episode was proudly produced by the Pre-Art Foundation for Art Science Innovation, and these conversations were made possible by the volunteer support of Broom Bettler, our lead project assistant, audio editing by Andrea Gutierrez, and video content formatting by Nomina Ramarari. Explore more episodes and interdisciplinary projects at creart.ca. That's www.crearte.ca.